All right, welcome back, philosopher friends. Today we're going to dive deep into a debate that really shook the philosophical world.
Oh yeah, this one gets pretty intense.
Yeah, it's about psychologism.
Psychologism.
And what we're going to be looking at are some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on psychologism.
A great overview of the whole debate. Yeah.
So what is psychologism? I think the simplest way to put it is that it's the view that logic, or really any non-psychological field, right, is ultimately based on psychology.
So the rules of logic, like the rules of valid reasoning and argumentation, they're not these, these objective, timeless, eternal things.
Right.
But they're really just reflections of how our minds happen to work. How we think, how we process information.
Yeah. So, it's not about these kind of eternal truths out there.
Right.
It's really just about how we're wired, so to speak. And as you can imagine, this idea really ignited some fireworks, particularly among philosophers in German-speaking countries in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Oh, yeah. They had a name for this thing, the Psychologismus Street.
Hmm.
The psychologism dispute.
You Psychologism Street. Yeah, it was a huge debate. People got really, really fired up about it.
And, for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
Because it really touches on some fundamental questions about, what is logic?
Right.
What's its relationship to our minds?
Right.
To truth, to knowledge, to the world?
Right, exactly. So our mission today is to kind of unpack this debate. Why was it so important? What were the key arguments? And what was at stake in this whole battle over the relationship between logic and psychology?
Yeah, and, it might seem like, oh, this is just a dusty old debate from 100 years ago.
Right.
But I think we'll see that these questions are still very much alive today. And, they really get to the heart of some of the most fundamental issues in philosophy.
They do. So to kick things off, let's start with a figure who kind of straddled both sides of the fence on this, John Stuart Mill.
Oh, Mill, yeah.
Now, his book, A System of Logic, which came out in 1843, was a major work, incredibly influential. But when you look closely at his views on logic and psychology, it's kind of a mixed bag, to say the least.
Yeah. He's not always super clear or consistent on this. Sometimes he seems to be saying, yeah, logic is totally based on psychology.
Right.
And then other times he seems to be pushing back against that.
Right. Like, no, logic's a separate thing altogether.
Exactly. So one thing that's helpful to understand about Mill is that he divided logic into two parts.
Okay.
There's the science of reasoning. And this is basically the descriptive psychology of how our minds work when we reason.
Okay, so that's like the nitty-gritty of how our thoughts connect and all that.
Exactly. And then there's the art of reasoning. And this is more about the rules we should follow to reason correctly.
Right. So the science is about how we do think, and the art is about how we thought to think.
Exactly.
And the big question, of course, is whether those two things are actually connected or whether they're totally separate.
Yeah, because if logic is just about how we happen to think,
right,
then how can there even be rules for how we should think?
Right. That's the tension right there.
Right.
So when we look at Mill's science of reasoning, his descriptive psychology, it's very much rooted in associationism.
Oh, yeah. Associationism. The big idea there is that our ideas are connected in our minds through various laws of association.
Okay.
Like, things that are similar or things that happen close together in time or space.
Right.
They tend to get linked together in our minds.
Okay, so it's all about these kind of mental connections.
Exactly. And Mill believed that the laws of reasoning were just a special case of these general laws of association.
Okay, so nothing unique about the way we reason, it's just part of how our minds work.
Right. And how do we figure out these laws of association, these laws of reasoning?
Well, how do we do it?
Empirically, through observation and experimentation.
Oh, so for Mill, it's all about looking at how people actually think.
Exactly. No armchair philosophizing here. It's got to be grounded in real-world data.
Okay. And then how does he bring in the art of reasoning, the prescriptive part?
Okay, so Mill gives us a couple of different ways of thinking about how the science of reasoning relates to the art of reasoning.
Right.
One way is to see them as kind of separate but complementary. So psychology analyzes the process of reasoning.
Right.
And the art just provides the rules for doing it correctly.
Okay. So they're like two sides of the same coin.
Right. But then he also suggests that understanding the mental process is really the basis for coming up with the rules.
Right, because if you don't know how people actually reason, how can you tell them how they should reason?
Exactly. And he goes even further than that. He says that the justification for the rules of the art of reasoning ultimately comes from psychology.
Whoa, hold on. So he's saying that the rules of logic, like the principle of non-contradiction, are only justified because of how our minds happen to work.
Yeah, that's what he seems to be saying.
Yeah.
And that definitely pushes him closer to the psychologistic camp.
It does, it does. And even when he tries to distance himself from psychologism a little bit, he ends up circling back. Like he emphasizes this object-focused view of logic,
Oh, yeah.
where it's not just about our concepts, but about the real world.
Right. So for Mill, logic isn't just about how our ideas relate to each other in our heads. It's also about how those ideas connect to the objects and facts out there in the world.
Exactly. He rejects conceptualism, this
Yeah.
idea that logic is all about our mental concepts and nothing more. He insists that our judgments, the things we say are true or false, have to be about something real.
Right. And this seems like a move away from psychologism. Like he's saying logic is grounded in something objective, not just in our subjective minds.
Right. But then, even with this object-focused view, he runs into trouble. Because he tries to ground all syllogistic reasoning, like the classic, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal kind of stuff.
Right.
He tries to ground all that in this principle of the transitivity of coexistence, which is basically the idea that if two things both coexist with a third thing, they must coexist with each other.
Okay. And how do we know the principle is true?
Well, according to Mill, we get it from experience. It's a generalization based on our observations of the world. Like, if we see that both A and B exist at the same time as C, then we can conclude that A and B exist at the same time as each other.
Okay, so it's kind of like an empirical observation about how things work in the world.
Exactly. And Mill argues that all general propositions, whether they're definitions, axioms, or laws of nature, are basically just summaries of our experiences.
So even the most basic principles of logic are ultimately rooted in experience, in how we perceive and interact with the world.
Right. And that brings them right back to psychologism. Because if logic is based on experience and experience is psychological, then logic must be psychological too.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope.
It is. It is. And this gets even more clear when you look at how he handles the principle of non-contradiction. This idea that something can't be both A and not A at the same time.
One of the most fundamental principles of logic, right?
Exactly. So how does he justify that one?
Well, get this. He says it's also an empirical generalization.
Oh, come on. Even non-contradiction.
Yeah. He says it comes from our experience of belief and disbelief.
Yeah.
We experience these as distinct and mutually exclusive mental states.
Mm.
So we generalize from that and say that something can't be both A and not A because we can't believe both A and not A at the same time.
Okay, so he's tying it back to our psychology again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, to really seal the deal, there's his phenomenalism.
Phenomenalism, right. That's the view that we only have direct access to our experiences, not to any kind of mind-independent reality.
Right. So for Mill, logical principles don't apply to things as they are in themselves, but only to things as they appear to us, as they are experienced by us.
Okay, and how does that relate to psychologism?
Well, if logic is about phenomena, about our experiences, then it must be based on psychology.
Right, because psychology is the study of the mind and experiences.
Exactly. So even though Mill tries to give logic this object-focused grounding, he ends up bringing it back to psychology in the end. And the Stanford Encyclopedia actually concludes that Mill is, at least in some of his writings, a psychologistic philosopher.
Yeah, so Mill, even with all his nuances and complexities, really provided a lot of fuel for the psychologism debate.
He did. So with that kind of background, let's jump into the Psychologismus street itself, this big, this big battle in German philosophy.
All right, let's do it.
And I think it's helpful to start by looking at the specific kinds of arguments that were being labeled as psychologistic during this time.
Okay, yeah, what were people actually arguing?
The Stanford Encyclopedia gives us a really nice breakdown of 5 common arguments.
5 arguments. Okay, let's hear them.
The first one, they call it PA1. And it basically goes like this. Psychology studies all the laws of thought.
Right.
Logic studies just a subset of those laws.
Okay.
Therefore, logic must be part of psychology. It's like, a subdiscipline.
Right, like botany is a subdiscipline of biology.
Exactly. And this was an argument that was attributed to Lips and Hamans.
Lips and Hamans, okay.
The second argument, PA2, this one brings in the idea of normative disciplines. disciplines that tell us what we ought to do.
Right, like ethics or aesthetics.
Exactly. So the argument goes, normative disciplines need a descriptive foundation. Like
Okay.
you can't just say what people ought to do without understanding how they actually do behave.
Right, right. You got to have some basis in reality.
Exactly. So logic is normative. It tells us how we ought to think.
Right.
Psychology is the only descriptive science of thought.
Okay.
Therefore, logic must be based on psychology.
Okay, so logic needs that psychological foundation to make sense.
Right. And this argument was associated with Wundt,
Okay, what's next?
PA3. This one focuses on the subject matter of logic itself.
Okay.
It says logic is about judgments, concepts, inferences, all that good stuff.
Right, the building blocks of logic.
Exactly.
Right,
But all those things are mental entities.
right. They exist in our mind.
And all mental entities are studied by psychology.
Okay.
Therefore, logic is part of psychology.
Okay, I'm seeing a pattern here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of these arguments are about trying to show that logic is ultimately about mental stuff and therefore belongs to the realm of psychology.
Right, right. Okay, what's argument number 4?
All right, PA4. This one brings in the feeling of self-evidence. When something just seems obviously true to us,
Right.
like 2 plus 2 equals 4, this feels right.
Yeah, yeah.
So the argument goes, the touchstone of logical truth is this feeling of self-evidence.
Okay.
But self-evidence is a mental experience.
Right, it's happening in our minds.
Therefore, logic is about a mental experience and therefore part of psychology.
Okay, so logic is grounded in how things feel to us subjectively.
Right. And this argument was associated with Elsenhans,
Else and hits. Okay, and the final argument.
PA5. This one deals with the limits of our thinking.
Okay.
It says, we can't even conceive of alternative logics, like different systems of logic where the rules are different.
Right.
But that inability to conceive is a mental limitation.
Okay.
So a logic must be relative to our human way of thinking.
Okay.
And what studies human thinking? Psychology.
Psychology, there we go.
So logic is ultimately grounded in psychology.
All right, so there you have it. 5 arguments, all trying to show that logic is somehow dependent on psychology.
And, it's worth noting that even at the time, there was debate about whether these thinkers actually held these views in this exact form.
Right, right. Philosophers always love to argue about what other philosophers really meant.
It's what we do best. But these arguments do capture the general flavor of psychologistic thinking during the street.
They do, they do. And the Stanford Encyclopedia actually gives us some really nice quotes that illustrate this psychologistic perspective.
Oh, yeah. The one from Lifts is great. He just comes right out and says, logic is a psychological discipline.
He does, doesn't he? No beating around the bush there.
No, he's very direct. He says that all knowledge comes about in the soul and that thinking itself is a psychological process.
Right, so if logic is about thinking and thinking is psychological, then logic must be psychological too.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the psychologistic side of the argument. Now let's bring in the heavy hitters who pushed back against this whole idea.
All right, time for the anti-psychologists.
And one of the most prominent figures on that side was Gottlob Frege, a name that should be familiar to anyone who's dabbled in logic or the philosophy of math.
Yeah, Frege was a huge figure.
Yeah.
And he was adamantly opposed to psychologism, especially when it came to logic and math. He thought those fields had to be independent of psychology, full stop.
Yeah, he really wanted to draw a clear line in the sand there.
He did.
Yeah.
And one of his main arguments against psychologism, which he lays out in his book, The Foundations of Arithmetic, has to do with the precision of math.
Okay.
He says math is all about exactness, rigor, getting things right down to the smallest detail.
Right, right.
But psychology, he argues, is a much fuzzier discipline. It deals with the messy, subjective world of the mind.
Okay, so math is all about precision. Psychology is all about, well, the opposite of precision.
Exactly. And Frege's point is that it just doesn't make sense to base something as precise and rigorous as math on something as imprecise as psychology.
Yeah, it's like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand. It's just not going to hold up.
Exactly. And beyond that, Frege really stresses this crucial distinction between our subjective ideas, our Vorstellungen, which are the mental images and representations we have in our heads, and objective, mind-independent objects like numbers.
Okay, so our ideas are personal and can vary from person to person, but numbers are the same for everyone.
Exactly. And Frege was really critical of the way that people often use the word idea to refer to both these subjective mental things and these objective abstract things. He thought that this ambiguity was a big source of confusion in the psychologism debate.
Right, because if you're not clear about what you mean by idea, you can easily end up conflating these two very different kinds of things.
Exactly. And for Frege, this distinction was absolutely fundamental. He also rejected any attempts to give psychological interpretations of Kant's distinctions between a priori and a posterior knowledge and between analytic and synthetic judgments.
Right, those classic Kantian distinctions. So, a priori knowledge is knowledge that we can have independent of experience, like the laws of logic. And a posteriori knowledge is knowledge that we get from experience, like knowing that the sky is blue.
Right. And analytic judgments are those where the predicate is already contained in the subject, like all bachelors are unmarried. And synthetic judgments are those where the predicate adds new information to the subject, like the cat is on the mat.
Okay, so Frege is saying that these distinctions aren't about how our minds work, but about the nature of justification and proof.
Exactly. They're about logic, not psychology.
Okay. And this leads him to his critique of Mill's philosophy of math.
Oh, yeah. Frege really goes after Mill on this one. He says that mathematical truths aren't just empirical facts that we've observed and generalized from. Like, what physical thing in the world corresponds to the number 0? Or to a number like 777,864?
Right, right. It's hard to see those numbers as just being summaries of our experiences.
Exactly. And Frege also points out that learning how to do math doesn't actually give us any new empirical knowledge about the world. It's a different kind of knowing altogether.
Okay, so he's drawing a clear distinction between mathematical knowledge and empirical knowledge.
He is. And he argues that Mill is wrong to think that all mathematical sentences derive from some general inductive law based on experience.
Right, because for Frege, math is all about deduction, about deriving theorems from axioms.
Exactly. And he even critiques Mill's view that numbers are just properties of aggregates or collections of things.
Right, like the number 3 is just a property of any group of 3 things.
Exactly. But Frege points out that aggregates don't inherently have a specific way of being divided. Like, you can divide a group of 3 things into 3 groups of 1, or 1 group of 3, or whatever.
Right.
And he also argues that the numbers 0 and 1 can't really be thought of as aggregates at all.
Okay, so he's poking holes in Mill's attempt to ground numbers in the physical world.
He is. He's saying that numbers are more abstract than that.
Okay, and this leads him to his famous foreword to his book, The Basic Laws of Arithmetic,
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
where he really goes all in on his anti-psychologism. So what are some of the key points he makes there?
Okay, well, first he talks about this ambiguity in the word law.
Right, because we use law in different ways. Like there are laws of nature, which describe how the world works,
Right.
and then there are laws in the sense of rules or commands, like the laws of a country.
Exactly. And Frege points out that any descriptive law, any law that describes how things are, can be turned into a prescriptive law, a law about how we should think.
Okay, how so?
Well, if a descriptive law is true, then we ought to think accordingly.
Right, like if it's a law of nature that water boils at a certain temperature,
Yeah.
then we should believe that water boils at that
Yeah,
temperature.
exactly. But Frege argues that while both kinds of laws can be called laws of thought, only the descriptive laws are really about psychology, because they're about how we actually do think, whereas the prescriptive laws are about how we should think, regardless of how we actually do think.
Right, right. So there's a difference between describing our thinking and prescribing our thinking.
Exactly. And Frege says that the psychologistic logicians, they conflate these two things. They confuse what's true with what people happen to believe.
Okay.
And he says that if you base prescriptions for thought on psychological laws, you're just telling people to conform to their current habits of thinking, which might be wrong.
Right, because just because everyone believes something doesn't make it true.
Exactly. And this leads him to one of his most famous quotes. If being true is thus independent of being acknowledged by somebody or other, then the laws of truth are not psychological laws. They are boundary stones set in an eternal foundation, which our thought can overflow but never displace.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. He's basically saying that truth is objective, it's out there, independent of our minds, and logic, as the study of truth, must be objective too.
Exactly. And he goes on to critique Benno Erdmann, who we mentioned earlier. Erdmann held this view that truth is just a matter of general consensus.
Okay, so if everyone agrees on something, then it's true.
Right. But Frege says that's completely backwards. Truth is independent of what people happen to believe.
Right, right. Like the earth was round even when everyone thought it was flat.
Exactly. And Frege also takes issue with Erdmann's idea that logic has only hypothetical necessity, meaning it's only necessary for humans, given how we're currently constituted.
Okay.
Frege says that if we met beings who didn't follow our laws of logic, we wouldn't just say, oh, they have a different but equally valid way of thinking.
Right.
We'd probably think they were insane.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because logic is universal. It's not just relative to human psychology.
Okay. Okay. So Frege is really pushing back against this idea that logic is somehow subjective or relative.
He is. He's saying that logic is about objective truth and that truth is independent of our minds.
Right. And then he gets into this really interesting discussion about the nature of knowledge.
Oh, yeah,
It-
where he talks about grasping versus creating.
Grasping versus creating. Okay, what's that all about?
So Frege argues that coming to know something isn't about creating that thing in our minds.
Okay.
It's about grasping something that's already out there, independent of us.
Okay, like when we see a tree, we're not creating the tree in our minds. We're just perceiving something that's already there.
Exactly. And Frege says it's the same with numbers and logical truths. We're not creating them when we think about them, we're grasping them.
Okay, so they're like objects that exist out there in some abstract realm.
Right. And he says that denying this objectivity leads to all sorts of problems, like idealism and solipsism.
Idealism is the view that reality is ultimately mental, right?
Right. And solipsism is the view that only one's own mind is real.
Right, so basically, if you deny the objective reality of things like numbers and logical truths, you end up in a world where everything is just your own mind.
Exactly. And Frege thought that was a dead end. He believed that we need to acknowledge the objective reality of things like numbers and logical truths in order to make sense of the world and to communicate with each other.
Right, right. It's like if everyone's just trapped in their own little mental world, then there's no way to have any shared understanding.
Exactly.
Okay, so Frege laid out a very strong anti-psychologistic position, and he even took aim at Husserl's early work, specifically his book, Philosophy of Arithmetic.
Oh, yeah.
In his review of that book, Frege basically called Husserl out for being a psychologistic philosopher.
He did. He said that Husserl was treating meanings, concepts, and objects as if they were just ideas in our heads,
Okay.
and that he was giving psychological explanations for how we develop these abstract concepts.
Right, which Frege saw as a big no-no.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while it's not clear how much Frege's critique actually influenced Husserl's later thinking, it definitely posed a challenge to his early views.
It did. It did. So, with that, let's turn to Husserl himself and his major work, The Logical Investigations.
All right, time for Husserl.
And in particular, we're going to focus on the prolegomena to those investigations, which was published in 1900. This became a really key text in the Psychologism street.
Oh, yeah. The prolegomena is a big one. It's basically Husserl's manifesto against psychologism.
Yeah, he really lays out his case there.
Yeah.
So how does he structure his argument?
Okay, well, he divides it into three main parts.
Okay.
The first part is about the nature of logic itself. He defines it as a practical normative discipline, meaning it's about how we ought to think, not just how we do think.
Okay.
And he also calls it a Wissenschaftslehre, which is a theory of science.
So logic is both about how to think correctly and about the foundations of science.
Exactly.
Okay.
The second part is where he really gets into his critique of psychologism. He argues that the theoretical foundations of logic are not psychological.
Right, so logic isn't based on psychology.
Exactly.
Right.
And then the third part is where he sketches out what he thinks the true non-psychological foundations of logic are.
Okay, so he tears down the psychologistic view and then tries to build something new in its place.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a good structure. Now, in that first part where he's defining logic, he makes a couple of important points.
Oh, yeah, he does.
First, he talks about logic as a Wissenschaftslehre, a theory of science. And he says that logic is what allows us to judge the validity of scientific methods,
Okay.
to understand the conceptual structure of different scientific disciplines, and to avoid errors in reasoning.
Right, so logic is like the toolbox for scientists. It gives them the tools they need to think clearly and do good science.
Exactly. And then the second point he makes is that normative disciplines, those that tell us how we ought to act or think,
Right.
they usually have non-normative theoretical foundations in other fields.
Okay. Like ethics might be based on our understanding of human psychology.
Exactly. So Husserl's saying that logic is similar. It's a normative discipline, but its theoretical foundation isn't psychology.
Okay. So he sets the stage by defining logic, and then he jumps into his critique of psychologism.
He does. And he actually starts by addressing and dismissing what he calls normative anti-psychologism,
Oh, okay.
which is basically the argument that psychology and logic have to be distinct because of the is-ought distinction.
Right, the fact that you can't derive an ought from an is.
Exactly. But Husserl actually agrees with the psychologistic thinkers on one point here.
Oh, really?
He says that thought as it ought to occur can be seen as a special case of thought as it actually occurs.
Okay.
So he's not denying that there's a connection between how we do think and how we ought to think.
Right, but he's saying that connection doesn't mean that logic is based on psychology.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he also addresses the circularity objection. The argument that you can't base logic on psychology because psychology itself uses logic.
Right, that's a classic objection.
It is, it is.
Mhm.
But Husserl says that psychology uses logic as a methodological tool, not as a foundational principle.
Okay, so psychology uses logic to help it think clearly, but it doesn't depend on logic for its basic principles.
Exactly. So Husserl clears those initial objections out of the way, and then he really gets into his attack on psychologism.
Okay, let's hear it.
And one of his main lines of attack is to point out what he sees as three really bad consequences that would follow if psychologism were true.
Oh, okay. It's a kind of reductio ad absurdum argument. If psychologism leads to absurd consequences, then it must be false.
Exactly. So what's the first bad consequence?
All right, consequence number one. If logical rules were based on psychological laws, then they would be just as vague and imprecise as psychological laws often are.
Okay.
But Husserl argues not all logical rules are vague. Some are very precise and clear-cut.
Right, like the rules of deduction in formal logic. They're very strict and well-defined.
Exactly. So not all logical rules can be based on psychology.
Okay, that's consequence number one. What about consequence number two?
Consequence number two is about a priori knowledge.
Okay.
Husserl says that if logical laws were just psychological laws, then we couldn't know them a priori.
Right, because a priori knowledge is knowledge that we have independent of experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Husserl argues that we do know logical laws a priori. They're self-evident and necessarily true, not just probable generalizations based on experience.
Okay. Okay. And the third bad consequence.
The third consequence is about what logical laws refer to.
Okay.
Husserl says that if logical laws were psychological laws, then they would be about psychological entities.
Right, like mental states or processes.
Exactly. But he argues that logical laws aren't about psychological entities at all. They're about truths, propositions, and the relationships between them.
Okay, so they're about something more abstract and objective.
Exactly.
Okay, so Husserl lays out these three bad consequences of psychologism, and then he goes on to argue that logical truths are eternal and unchanging.
Oh, right. Because if truths change, then the laws of logic would have to change too.
Exactly. But Husserl doesn't think truths change. He thinks they're timeless and eternal.
Okay, so that's another reason why logic can't be based on psychology, because psychology studies things that change over time.
Right. And Husserl even gets into this really abstract argument involving a symbolic representation of a logical law and some assumptions about laws and truths. And he shows that if you assume that truths are eternal and that laws have to be about something that exists, then you run into some really weird paradoxes if you try to say that logical laws are about psychological processes.
Okay, so he's using